My name is Margaret, and I'm 55 years old. As I sit here in this cold prison cell, staring through these iron bars, I can barely recognize the woman I used to be. 3 years ago, I had everything a person could dream of. A stunning $4.8 million home in Beverly Hills, a thriving interior design company generating over $3 million annually, and a stock portfolio worth $13 million. But most importantly, I had complete faith in my daughter Cheryl. I trusted her with my life, my fortune, and my future. Little did I know that sometimes the person you trust most becomes the very one who destroys you completely. Before I share this story with you, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. Subscribe to hear more stories about human resilience and the power of justice. Now let me take you back to 2018, when my perfect life began crumbling into a nightmare I never saw coming. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like before everything fell apart. I had built my interior design company from the ground up over 23 years. We specialized in luxury residential projects throughout Southern California, and our client list included celebrities, tech executives, and old money families. My office overlooked Rodeo Drive, and every morning I'd arrive in my silver Mercedes, feeling grateful for how far I'd come from my modest beginnings in Ohio. My Beverly Hills home was my sanctuary. 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, an infinity pool that seemed to flow into the horizon, and a wine cellar that housed bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries. The walls displayed artwork I'd collected over the years, including 2 original Picasso sketches and a stunning Monet that hung above my marble fireplace. Everything was perfectly curated, just like the homes I designed for my wealthy clients. But the crown jewel of my life was my relationship with Cheryl. My 28-year-old daughter had always been brilliant, graduating summa cum laude from Stanford Law School. She'd just started working at Harrison & Associates, a small but prestigious law firm in downtown Los Angeles. Cheryl had inherited my drive and ambition, always talking about her plans to become a partner by 35. Our relationship had always been special. After my divorce from her father Richard 5 years earlier, Cheryl and I had grown even closer. Richard had tried desperately to claim half of my assets during the divorce, arguing that my business success was partly due to his emotional support during the early years. The court disagreed, recognizing that I'd built everything through my own talent and relentless work ethic. Richard walked away with minimal alimony and a deep resentment that he never bothered to hide. These days, Richard lived in a cramped apartment in Van Nuys, working as a mid-level accountant. He'd call Cheryl regularly, and I knew from her uncomfortable expressions after these conversations that he spent most of their time together complaining about me and the divorce settlement. I tried not to let it bother me, but sometimes I wondered if his bitterness was poisoning my daughter's mind against me. One particular evening in March, Cheryl and I met for dinner at Nobu in Malibu. The sunset painted the Pacific in shades of gold and coral as we sat on the restaurant's famous terrace. Cheryl looked stunning in a black Armani dress I'd bought her for her birthday, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders in perfect waves. "Mom, I've been thinking about something important," she said, twirling her chopsticks around expensive sashimi. "You've worked so hard to build this incredible life, but have you thought about protecting it properly?" I raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of my sake. "What do you mean, honey?" "Your estate planning. When was the last time you updated your will?" Her blue eyes, so much like mine, showed genuine concern. "With your net worth being what it is, you need to make sure everything is structured correctly. You know how complex tax law can be, especially in California." The conversation felt odd, but Cheryl was a lawyer after all. It made sense that she'd think about these practical matters. "I suppose it has been a few years since I reviewed everything with my attorney." "Exactly. And with Dad constantly complaining about the divorce, what if he tries to challenge things later? You need ironclad documentation." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm not trying to be morbid, Mom, I just want to make sure your wishes are crystal clear and that your legacy is protected." Her words made sense, and I felt touched by her concern for my well-being. "All right, you've convinced me. I'll call Morrison and Partners next week to schedule an appointment." "Perfect." Cheryl smiled, but something in her expression seemed almost relieved. "I think you should be very specific about percentages, too. Maybe 80% to me and smaller amounts to charities or other family members. That way, there's no ambiguity." I agreed readily. Cheryl was my only child, and naturally she would inherit the bulk of my estate. The specific percentage seemed reasonable, especially since she'd be the one managing everything if something happened to me. As we finished dinner, watching the last traces of sunlight disappear into the ocean, I felt grateful to have such a thoughtful, practical daughter looking out for me. 2 weeks later, I signed the updated will in my attorney's office designating Cheryl as the beneficiary of 80% of my assets, with the remaining 20% split between several charities I'd supported over the years. The document was notarized, filed, and stored in the firm's vault. I felt organized and responsible, never imagining I'd just signed the blueprint for my own destruction. Everything changed when Sarah Chen entered our lives, though I didn't realize it at the time. Sarah had been Cheryl's roommate at Stanford, and they'd maintained their friendship even after graduation. While Cheryl worked at a smaller firm, Sarah had landed a position at Wilson Klein & Associates, one of Los Angeles' most prestigious corporate law firms. She specialized in financial litigation and had already made partner at 31-something that clearly bothered Cheryl. I'd met Sarah several times at various events and always found her to be intelligent, direct, and refreshingly honest. She had shoulder-length black hair, wore minimal makeup, and preferred tailored business suits to the more fashionable outfits Cheryl favored. There was something solid and trustworthy about Sarah that I appreciated. One Tuesday afternoon in late April, I was reviewing fabric samples in my home office when my housekeeper announced that Sarah Chen was at the front door asking to speak with me privately. This surprised me since Sarah had never visited without Cheryl before. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said as I led her into my living room, "I apologize for coming unannounced, but I need to discuss something very serious with you about Cheryl." The formal tone in her voice immediately put me on alert. Sarah sat rigidly on the edge of my white leather sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've discovered some things at work that involve your daughter, and I believe you have a right to know." "What kind of things?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. 3 weeks ago, I noticed some irregularities in case files that Cheryl had worked on. Client trust account discrepancies, forged signatures on settlement documents, and what appears to be systematic embezzlement. My stomach dropped. "That's impossible. Cheryl would never do anything like that." "I thought the same thing initially." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. I tried to find explanations, hoping I was wrong, but the evidence kept mounting. She handed me a stack of photocopied documents. "These are copies of the original paperwork versus the versions Cheryl submitted to the partners. Look at the signature on this settlement agreement." I studied the papers, my hands trembling slightly. Even to my untrained eye, the signatures looked different. This could be a mistake, a clerical error. "Mrs. Patterson, I recorded a conversation with Cheryl last week." Sarah pulled out a small digital recorder. I confronted her privately first, giving her a chance to explain. "I think you should hear this." She pressed play, and Cheryl's voice filled my elegant living room. The conversation was devastating. In it, Cheryl admitted to taking money from client accounts, justifying it by saying the firm's partners were old-fashioned and didn't appreciate her contributions. She talked about planning to leave the firm soon anyway and start her own practice with the resources she'd accumulated. "How much money are we talking about?" I whispered. "From what I can document, at least $600,000 over the past 8 months. Sarah's expression was pained. "But I think there might be more. Some of the transactions are very sophisticated, almost like she had help from someone with advanced financial knowledge." My mind immediately went to Richard. His accounting background would certainly qualify him to help structure complex financial schemes, but I pushed that thought away, still struggling to believe my daughter was capable of this. "Mrs. Patterson, there's something else." Sarah hesitated. "I've been reviewing your daughter's spending patterns through social media and public records. She's made some very expensive purchases recently. A new BMW, a condo in Santa Monica that she's keeping secret, and she's been taking frequent trips to Las Vegas." "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been trying to help her. I thought maybe she was in financial trouble and needed assistance, but when I offered to lend her money, she laughed and said she had everything under control." Sarah closed the folder. "Mrs. Patterson, I think Cheryl might be taking money from you too. Has she had access to your accounts recently?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Over the past few months, Cheryl had helped me with various financial tasks. She'd accompanied me to the bank several times, had access to my home office where I kept financial documents, and I'd even given her power of attorney for certain business transactions while I traveled to New York for a major project. "I need to check my accounts," I said, my voice barely audible. Sarah stood up. "I'm sorry to bring you this information. I know how much you love Cheryl, and I love her too. That's why I'm here. She needs help before this destroys her career and potentially lands her in prison." After Sarah left, I spent 3 hours on the phone with my various financial institutions. What I discovered made me physically ill. Over the past 6 months, there had been numerous transfers from my accounts that I hadn't authorized. Small amounts at first, 10,000 here, 15,000 there. But in recent weeks, the amounts had grown larger. 50,000 transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Another 40,000 moved to what appeared to be an investment account that had never been discussed with me. When I called Cheryl that evening, she had explanations for everything. The transfers were investments she'd made on my behalf, she said. She'd found some excellent opportunities and wanted to surprise me with the returns. The power of attorney gave her the legal right to make these moves, and she'd planned to show me all the paperwork the following weekend, but something in her voice sounded different, more confident, almost cocky. And when I mentioned Sarah's visit, Cheryl's tone became ice cold. "Mom, Sarah is jealous of our relationship and my success at the firm. She's been trying to undermine me for months, and now she's trying to turn you against me." Cheryl's voice took on a wounded quality. "I can't believe you'd listen to her accusations instead of trusting your own daughter." The conversation ended with Cheryl in tears, begging me not to have any more contact with Sarah. She painted a picture of a woman consumed by envy, desperate to destroy their friendship and damage Cheryl's relationship with me. Against my better judgment, and swayed by my love for my daughter, I agreed to cut off communication with Sarah. It was the biggest mistake of my life. 3 weeks after my confrontation with Cheryl, she called me in a state of panic that I'd never heard before. Her voice was shaking, and she could barely get the words out between sobs. "Mom, Sarah is completely out of control. She's threatening to destroy my career and take everything I've worked for." Cheryl's breathing was ragged. "She's demanding $2 million to keep quiet about the false accusations she's made against me." $2 million? I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. "Cheryl, that's extortion." "That's exactly what it is. She says if I don't pay her by Friday, she'll file a complaint with the State Bar Association and send her fabricated evidence to the district attorney's office." Cheryl's voice cracked. "Mom, I don't have that kind of money, and even if I did, paying her would make me look guilty of things I never did." My maternal instincts kicked in immediately. The idea that someone was threatening my daughter filled me with rage. "We need to call the police, report the extortion. It's her word against mine, and she's already planted seeds of doubt about my character." Cheryl sounded defeated. "She's been so careful, Mom. She has no written demands, just verbal threats made when we're alone. She knows exactly what she's doing." Over the next hour, Cheryl painted a picture of Sarah as a master manipulator who'd been planning this scheme for months. According to Cheryl, Sarah had been documenting everything, creating a false narrative designed to frame Cheryl for crimes she never committed. The goal was simple: destroy Cheryl's career and reputation, then swoop in as the hero who discovered the wrongdoing. She even admitted she's been tracking my spending, taking photos of my car, following me around the city. Cheryl's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm scared, Mom. What if she plants evidence? What if she's already done it? The more Cheryl talked, the more convinced I became that Sarah Chen was a dangerous sociopath who'd fooled everyone with her professional demeanor and seemingly ethical character. The woman who'd sat in my living room 3 weeks earlier suddenly seemed calculated and predatory in my memory. Where does she live? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Mom, you can't get involved directly. Sarah is unpredictable, and I don't want her targeting you too. But then Cheryl mentioned almost casually that Sarah lived in a quiet neighborhood in Culver City near the Kenneth Hahn State Recreation Area. She mentioned that Sarah had a habit of taking evening walks through the park, something she'd posted about on her fitness app. She usually goes around 8:30 after dinner, Cheryl said. She walks the same route every night like clockwork. She posted about it just yesterday, talking about how the routine helps her clear her mind after stressful days at work. By Thursday evening, I'd made my decision. I was going to confront Sarah Chen directly, woman to woman, and put an end to her extortion scheme once and for all. I wasn't going to let anyone destroy my daughter's life, especially not someone I'd welcomed into my home and trusted. Friday night, I drove my Mercedes to Culver City, parking on a residential street about 3 blocks from the park entrance. I'd chosen to carry my purse, which contained a small folding knife I kept for self-defense, something I'd carried since my divorce when Richard had made several threatening phone calls. I had no intention of using it, but given Sarah's erratic behavior, I wanted to be prepared for anything. The park was quieter than I'd expected. A few joggers passed by, but most of the walking paths were empty as the sun began to set. I found Sarah exactly where Cheryl had predicted, walking alone on the trail that curved around the small lake in the center of the recreation area. Sarah, I called out as I approached her. She turned, and her face went pale when she saw me. Mrs. Patterson, what are you doing here? We need to talk about your demands. This extortion has to stop. Sarah's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, then to something that looked like fear. Extortion, Mrs. Patterson? I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't play games with me. $2 million or you destroy Cheryl's career. Those were your terms, weren't they? I never demanded any money from Cheryl. Sarah's voice was steady, but she took a step backward. Mrs. Patterson, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is thinking you could get away with this. I moved closer, my anger building. I know what kind of person you really are, Sarah. You fooled me before, but not anymore. Please listen to me, Sarah said urgently. I never asked Cheryl for money, but I have been investigating her financial activities, and what I found is worse than I originally thought. She pulled out her phone. Mrs. Patterson, Cheryl has been stealing from you for over a year, large amounts. I have documentation that shows she's taken nearly $800,000 from your accounts. The words hit me like a slap. That's impossible. Look at these bank records. Sarah held up her phone, showing me what appeared to be screenshots of financial transactions. These transfers weren't investments, Mrs. Patterson. They went to accounts that Cheryl controls. She's been systematically looting your wealth and counting on your trust to keep you from noticing. I stared at the phone screen, my vision blurring as the numbers came into focus. The dates, the amounts, the account numbers, all of it looked legitimate. But before I could process what I was seeing, before Sarah could explain further, the world exploded into chaos. The gunshot came from somewhere in the trees to our left. The sound was deafening, echoing across the water, and sending several ducks into panicked flight. Sarah's body jerked violently, and she collapsed to the ground, blood spreading across her white jogging shirt. Sarah! I dropped to my knees beside her, pressing my hands against the wound in her chest. Blood seeped between my fingers, warm and sticky. "Oh God, Sarah, stay with me!" Her eyes were wide with shock and pain. She tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound came out. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. From somewhere behind me, a voice screamed, "She shot her! That woman shot her!" I turned to see a jogger pointing in my direction, his face twisted with horror. Panic consumed me. My hands were covered in Sarah's blood. My clothes were stained, and I was kneeling over her body, with what must have looked like guilt written all over my face. Without thinking clearly, driven by pure terror, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran through the park, past the jogger, who was already on his phone, with what I assumed was 911, past the few other evening visitors who turned to stare at this blood-covered woman fleeing the scene. I reached my car and drove home in a state of complete shock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. At home, I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes, unable to process what had just happened. Someone had shot Sarah Chen while she was talking to me. Someone had been hiding in those trees, watching us waiting. But who and why I never called the police. I never reported what I'd witnessed. I was too scared, too confused, and too ashamed of my own actions that evening. Instead, I went inside, threw my blood-stained clothes into the washing machine, and tried to convince myself that somehow everything would be okay. It was the second biggest mistake of my life. The police arrived at my door at 6:15 the following morning. I was barely dressed, having spent most of the night sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee, and trying to make sense of what had happened to Sarah. When I opened the door to see Detective Morrison's badge, my knees nearly gave out. "Margaret Patterson, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Chen." Detective Morrison's voice was professional but firm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he read me my Miranda rights, my mind went completely blank. Murder. They thought I had murdered Sarah. The handcuffs felt cold and impossibly heavy as they clicked around my wrists. At the police station, the evidence against me seemed overwhelming. Security cameras from a nearby business had captured my Mercedes in the area around the time of the shooting. The cameras clearly showed me walking into the park and then running back to my car 23 minutes later. "We found Sarah Chen's blood on your clothing, Mrs. Patterson," Detective Morrison explained during my first interrogation. "We found your fingerprints on her body and her phone, and we found the murder weapon." They showed me photographs of a 9mm handgun that had been discovered in a dumpster 3 blocks from my house. The serial number traced back to a gun shop in Glendale, where, according to their records, I had handled that exact weapon 6 months earlier while considering a purchase for home protection. "I never bought that gun," I insisted. "I looked at it, yes, but I decided against purchasing it." "But you did handle it. Your fingerprints are on file from the background check application you filled out." Detective Morrison spread the photos across the metal table. "Your prints are on the weapon, Mrs. Patterson. Your car was at the scene. The victim's blood is on your clothes. You were seen fleeing the scene by multiple witnesses." The case against me seemed airtight, but I knew I hadn't pulled that trigger. Someone else had been in those trees, someone who had planned this entire scenario. But who? And why would they want Sarah Chen dead? Cheryl arrived at the police station 3 hours after my arrest. Her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking as she signed papers to hire an attorney for me. She looked devastated, genuinely shocked by the charges against me. "Mom, I can't believe this is happening," she sobbed as we met in the consultation room. "Why were you even at that park? Why didn't you tell me you were going to confront Sarah?" I explained about the extortion demands, about my decision to handle the situation myself. Cheryl's face showed a mixture of love, disappointment, and fear as she listened. "I never wanted you to get involved directly," she whispered. "I was handling it through legal channels. Sarah wasn't going to follow through on her threats." "But you said she was demanding $2 million. Cheryl nodded miserably. "She was, but my supervisor at the firm was already suspicious of her behavior. I was building a case to expose her before she could damage my reputation." The attorney Cheryl hired was James Williams, a criminal defense lawyer with a solid reputation, but not the high-profile advocate I would have chosen if I'd been thinking clearly. Williams was competent but not particularly creative, and he seemed to accept the prosecution's narrative more readily than I would have liked. The trial began 4 months later. The prosecution painted me as a wealthy woman who would do anything to protect her daughter's reputation and inheritance. They argued that I had confronted Sarah to stop her from exposing Cheryl's alleged crimes, and when Sarah refused to back down, I had shot her in cold blood. The evidence seemed damning. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Patricia Hendricks, methodically presented the timeline of events, the physical evidence and testimony from witnesses who had seen me at the scene. "Margaret Patterson went to that park with premeditation," Hendricks told the jury during her opening statement. "She brought a weapon. She confronted the victim in an isolated location, and when Sarah Chen refused to be intimidated, the defendant made a calculated decision to silence her permanently." Williams did his best to create reasonable doubt, arguing that someone else could have been in the park that night, that the gun could have been planted, that the timeline didn't definitively prove I had fired the weapon. But his arguments felt weak against the mountain of physical evidence. The most difficult part of the trial was Cheryl's testimony. She took the stand as a character witness describing our close relationship and insisting that I was incapable of violence. But under cross-examination, she was forced to admit that I had been extremely angry about Sarah's alleged extortion attempts. "Your mother was furious that someone was threatening your career, wasn't she?" Hendricks pressed. "Yes," Cheryl answered quietly, tears streaming down her face. "But she would never hurt anyone. She was just trying to protect me." "Protect you enough to kill for you," Williams objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen that I had both motive and opportunity, and the physical evidence provided the means. After 6 days of testimony and 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found me guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced me to 15 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years, if I demonstrated good behavior and genuine remorse. As the bailiff led me away in shackles, I caught Cheryl's eye one last time. She was sobbing uncontrollably, and I could see the guilt and anguish written across her face. My beautiful, brilliant daughter believed that her mother was a murderer and that she was partially responsible for driving me to that desperate act. The irony was devastating. I had been trying to protect Cheryl from what I believed was Sarah's manipulation, but instead, I had destroyed both of our lives and taken the life of an innocent woman who had been trying to help us both. Prison was a culture shock that nearly broke me during those first few months. Sand Valley Women's Correctional Facility housed everything from white-collar criminals to violent offenders, and I quickly learned that my privileged background made me a target for both resentment and exploitation. My cellmate was a 53-year-old woman named Rosa Martinez, who had been serving 8 years for armed robbery. Rosa was tough, street-smart, and surprisingly well-read. She had grown up in East Los Angeles, dropped out of high school to support her younger siblings, and had made a series of bad decisions that eventually landed her in prison. But she was also observant, intelligent, and possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that proved invaluable. While I struggled to adapt to the loss of privacy, the institutional food, and the constant noise, my external world was collapsing just as dramatically. Cheryl was forced to liquidate my assets to pay for legal fees and appeals. The interior design company, which had been my life's work, was sold to a competitor for a fraction of its actual value due to the negative publicity surrounding my case. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but the market conditions are terrible right now," Cheryl explained during one of her visits. The real estate attorney says we're lucky to get $8.2 million for the house and the business combined. The number made no sense to me. My house alone had been appraised at $4.8 million just 2 years earlier, and the business had generated over $3 million in annual revenue. Even in a down market, the combined value should have been at least $15 million. What about my investment portfolio? I asked. Cheryl's expression was pained. The legal fees have been astronomical, Mom. Between Williams's fee, the appeal attorney, the private investigators, and the expert witnesses, we've spent over $600,000. And there are still ongoing costs for your appeals process. Something felt wrong about the numbers, but I was in no position to investigate. I was isolated, dependent on Cheryl for all information about my financial affairs and fighting the psychological trauma of imprisonment. I trusted my daughter to handle everything honestly, even as nagging doubts began to grow in the back of my mind. Rosa listened to my story over several weeks, asking probing questions and pointing out inconsistencies that I had missed. She had grown up around con artists and criminals, and she recognized patterns that my privileged background had left me unprepared to see. "Margaret, your daughter's story doesn't add up," Rosa said one evening as we lay in our narrow bunks. If Sarah Chen was really extorting Cheryl, why didn't Cheryl have any written evidence? No texts, no emails, no recorded demands. Sarah was too smart for that. She only made verbal threats. And conveniently, Cheryl knew exactly where Sarah would be walking that night, down to the specific time and route. Rosa's voice was skeptical. How did she know Sarah's routine so precisely? The questions bothered me, but I pushed them away. Cheryl was my daughter, the only family I had left. She was also the only person still fighting for my freedom and managing what remained of my financial life. But Rosa's suspicions planted seeds that grew stronger over time. Using my limited phone privileges, I began asking Cheryl more detailed questions about the asset sales and legal expenses. Her answers became increasingly vague, and she seemed frustrated by my inquiries. "Mom, I'm doing the best I can with an impossible situation," she said during one particularly tense call. "Do you want me to just let everything fall apart?" "No, I just want to understand where the money is going." "It's going to keep you out of prison for life. It's going to fund your appeals. It's going to make sure you have something left when you get out of this place." Cheryl's voice was sharp. "I'm sacrificing my own life to clean up this mess." After that conversation, I made a decision that would change everything. Using the small amount of money I had left in my commissary account, I hired a private investigator named Michael Thompson. Thompson specialized in financial fraud cases and had experience working with incarcerated clients who suspected their families of stealing from them while they were imprisoned. Thompson was a former LAPD detective who had started his own investigation firm after retiring from the force. He was methodical, thorough, and most importantly, he was willing to work for a significantly reduced fee in exchange for a percentage of any recovered assets. What Thompson discovered over the next 6 weeks shattered what remained of my faith in human nature and revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed my life. The first breakthrough came when Thompson accessed public records showing that my Beverly Hills house had actually sold for its full appraised value of $4.8 million, not the reduced amount Cheryl had reported to me. Similarly, my business had been purchased by Wilson & Associates, Sarah Chen's former firm, for its complete book value of over $2 million. But the most devastating discovery was a Cayman Islands bank account that had been opened in Cheryl's name 8 months before Sarah's murder. Thompson's contacts in the international banking community revealed that this account had received a series of large transfers totaling over $18.7 million. The money had come from the sales of my assets, but instead of being used for legal fees, as Cheryl had claimed, it had been moved offshore and hidden from any potential oversight. Thompson also uncovered evidence that Cheryl had been planning this scheme for over a year. She had researched offshore banking procedures, studied estate law loopholes, and even taken shooting lessons at a private gun club in Pasadena. The instructor remembered her specifically because she had insisted on learning to shoot with her non-dominant hand, claiming she wanted to be prepared for any self-defense scenario. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. Thompson had tracked down Harold Rogers, a homeless man who lived in Kenneth Hahn State Recreation Area, and had witnessed the shooting. Rogers had been sleeping in a makeshift shelter about 50 yards from where Sarah had been killed, and he had seen everything. There was a young blonde woman hiding in the trees before the older lady showed up, Rogers told Thompson. She had something in her hands looked like a gun. When the two women started arguing, the blonde one moved closer, real quiet-like. After the shot, she ran the opposite direction from the older lady. I was too scared to say anything to the cops when they came. Thompson recorded Rogers' statement and obtained additional evidence that corroborated his account. Security cameras from a nearby parking area had captured Cheryl's BMW entering and leaving the park area around the time of the shooting, though the footage wasn't clear enough to definitively identify her as the driver. Most damning of all, Thompson discovered a recording device that Cheryl had apparently dropped while fleeing the scene. The device contained audio of the entire confrontation between Sarah and me, including Sarah's attempts to show me evidence of Cheryl's theft. But more importantly, it contained Cheryl's voice captured as she moved through the trees before the shooting. On the recording, Cheryl could be heard whispering into what appeared to be a phone. "She's showing Mom the bank records. I can't let her see everything. I have to do this now." The evidence was overwhelming. My daughter had not only stolen nearly $19 million from me, but she had murdered Sarah Chen to prevent the theft from being exposed, and then manipulated me into appearing at the scene to take the blame for her crime. Thompson submitted his findings to the district attorney's office and requested an immediate review of my case. The request for a new trial was filed within days, and the evidence was so compelling that the prosecutor agreed to expedited hearings. My world had been turned upside down twice. First, when I was convicted of a murder I didn't commit. And now when I learned that my own daughter had committed that murder and systematically destroyed my life to cover her tracks. The courtroom was packed for the hearing that would determine whether I would get a new trial. Thompson had done his work thoroughly, and the evidence he presented was methodical and devastating. The prosecution team that had originally convicted me now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of reviewing a case that appeared to have been built on an elaborate deception. Detective Morrison, who had arrested me 3 years earlier, took the stand to acknowledge that several key pieces of evidence had been overlooked during the original investigation. The security footage showing Cheryl's car in the area had been dismissed as irrelevant because she was considered a grieving family member rather than a suspect. Rogers's potential testimony had never been pursued because he was deemed an unreliable witness due to his homeless status and history of mental health issues. But the most dramatic moment came when Thompson presented the recovered recording device. The courtroom fell silent as Cheryl's voice filled the space, her whispered phone conversation providing chilling evidence of premeditation and guilt. "She's showing Mom the bank records. I can't let her see everything. I have to do this now." The judge ordered an immediate investigation into Cheryl's financial activities and issued a warrant for her arrest. But when police arrived at her Santa Monica condo, they discovered that she had fled the country 2 days earlier. A review of her banking records showed that she had transferred the bulk of her hidden assets to accounts in non-extradition countries and purchased a one-way ticket to a nation that had no formal agreement to return suspected criminals to the United States. The ballistics expert who testified during the new hearing confirmed that the angle of the bullet wound in Sarah's chest was inconsistent with the shot fired from my position during the confrontation. The trajectory indicated that the shooter had been positioned in the trees approximately where Rogers claimed to have seen the blonde woman hiding. The firearms expert who had trained Cheryl at the gun club testified that she had specifically requested lessons in shooting with her non-dominant hand and had practiced extensively with 9mm weapons similar to the one used to kill Sarah. He also confirmed that Cheryl had asked detailed questions about how to minimize gunshot residue and fingerprint evidence when handling firearms, But perhaps the most damning evidence was the financial trail that Thompson had uncovered. Bank records subpoenaed from both domestic and international institutions showed a clear pattern of systematic theft that had begun more than 18 months before Sarah's murder. Cheryl had been slowly draining my accounts, testing my attention to detail, and gradually increasing the amounts as she became more confident in her ability to manipulate me. The investigation revealed that Cheryl had stolen a total of $21.3 million from my various accounts and assets. She had used sophisticated financial instruments and shell companies to hide the theft, demonstrating a level of planning and knowledge that could only have come from extensive preparation. When the prosecutor called Cheryl's former colleagues at Harrison & Associates to testify, they revealed additional information that painted a picture of a woman who had been planning this scheme for years. Cheryl had frequently asked questions about estate law, inheritance disputes, and criminal defense strategies. She had also shown unusual interest in cases involving financial fraud and had volunteered to assist with research on several high-profile embezzlement trials. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Sarah Chen's sister, who had flown in from San Francisco to attend the hearing. She described Sarah as a dedicated attorney who had genuinely cared about Cheryl and had struggled with the decision to expose her friend's criminal activities. Sarah agonized over what to do. Her sister testified. She loved Cheryl like family, but she couldn't stand by and watch her destroy her own life and hurt innocent people. Sarah thought she could convince Cheryl to confess and make things right before anyone got seriously hurt. When all the evidence had been presented, the judge had no choice but to overturn my conviction. The original case had been built on circumstantial evidence that appeared compelling, but was ultimately the result of an elaborate frame job orchestrated by the real killer. "Mrs. Patterson," the judge said as he formally vacated my sentence, "the court extends its deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice you have endured. While we cannot return the years you have lost, we can ensure that the truth has finally been revealed and that you are free to rebuild your life." As the bailiff removed my handcuffs for the final time, I felt a complex mixture of relief, anger, and profound sadness. I was free, but my daughter was now a fugitive, wanted for murder and grand theft. The family I had thought I was protecting had been destroyed by the very person I had loved most in the world. Cheryl was arrested 3 months later in Costa Rica, where she had been living under an assumed identity. The extradition process took another 8 months, during which time I had to testify via video link about her crimes and their impact on my life. When she finally returned to face trial, she was convicted of first-degree murder, embezzlement, and conspiracy charges that carried a combined sentence of 25 years to life. Walking out of Sand Valley Women's Correctional Facility after 3 years and 4 months was surreal. The world had changed while I was inside, but more importantly, I had changed in ways I was still trying to understand. The woman who entered that prison had been naive, trusting, and focused on material success. The woman who emerged was harder, more skeptical, and acutely aware of how quickly a life could be destroyed by those closest to you. The legal process of recovering my stolen assets took another 2 years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees. International banking laws made it difficult to trace money that had been moved through multiple offshore accounts, and much of what Cheryl had stolen had been spent on luxury purchases or transferred to accounts that were beyond the reach of U.S. courts. In the end, I recovered approximately $12.3 million of the $21 million that had been taken from me. The rest was gone forever, disappeared into the complex world of international finance that Cheryl had used to hide her crimes. My Beverly Hills house had been sold to pay legal fees. My interior design company had been absorbed by a competitor, and my reputation in the design world had been permanently damaged by the publicity surrounding my trial. But I was alive, I was free, and I had learned lessons about human nature that were worth more than any material possession I had lost. I moved to a modest apartment in Santa Barbara, far from the Los Angeles area, where my story was still occasionally featured in true crime documentaries and legal journals. The apartment was small, but comfortable, with a view of the ocean that reminded me every morning that life continued beyond the walls of any prison, literal or metaphorical. Using a portion of my recovered assets, I started a small consulting business that specialized in helping victims of financial crimes navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. My experience with both wealth and poverty, freedom and imprisonment, gave me a unique perspective that was valuable to others who had been betrayed by family members or trusted advisors. The work was fulfilling in ways that my previous career had never been. Instead of designing beautiful spaces for wealthy clients, I was helping real people recover from devastating losses and find the strength to move forward. Each case reminded me that my experience, while traumatic, was not unique, and that the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience was virtually unlimited. I still received letters from Cheryl in prison, usually around holidays or on my birthday. The letters were filled with apologies, explanations, and requests for forgiveness that I was not yet ready to grant. She claimed that her father, Richard, had manipulated her into believing that I owed him money from the divorce and that stealing from me had seemed justified at first. She insisted that she had never intended for anyone to get hurt, and that Sarah's murder had been a desperate split-second decision when she realized her theft was about to be exposed. I never responded to these letters, but I never threw them away either. They sat in a box in my bedroom closet, a reminder of the complicated nature of love and betrayal within families. I still loved Cheryl despite everything she had done, but I also knew that rebuilding any kind of relationship with her would require years of therapy and forgiveness work that I wasn't sure I was capable of doing. The therapy I underwent after my release helped me understand that I had played a role in creating the circumstances that led to my downfall. My need to be the perfect mother, my desire to give Cheryl everything she wanted, and my reluctance to set boundaries had enabled her worst impulses. I had taught her through my actions that money could solve any problem, and that my love was unconditional, regardless of her behavior. Dr. Rebecca Martinez. My therapist helped me see that healthy relationships require accountability, and that unconditional love, while beautiful in theory, can become destructive when it enables harmful behavior. I had to learn to love myself enough to set boundaries even with family members, and to recognize that protecting someone from consequences often prevents them from learning and growing. The most difficult part of my recovery was accepting that I might never fully understand why Cheryl had chosen to destroy so many lives for money. The woman who had sat across from me at dinner in Malibu discussing estate planning with apparent concern for my welfare had already been stealing from me and planning my downfall. The daughter who had testified tearfully at my trial, proclaiming my innocence, had known that she was the real killer. But I also learned that understanding someone's motivations wasn't necessary for moving forward with my own life. I couldn't change what had happened, and I couldn't undo the damage that had been done to Sarah Chen's family, my reputation, or the years I had lost. What I could do was choose how to spend the years I had remaining and what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. On quiet evenings in my Santa Barbara apartment, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, I often reflected on the difference between the life I had planned and the life I was actually living. The planned life had been focused on accumulating wealth, maintaining appearances, and achieving success as defined by others. The actual life was smaller in material terms, but richer in meaning, purpose, and genuine human connection. I had learned that sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we love most. But I had also learned that survival and resilience are possible even after the most devastating losses. I had discovered that starting over at 58 was difficult, but not impossible, and that building a life based on service to others was more fulfilling than building one based purely on personal achievement. Most importantly, I had learned to love myself enough to set boundaries, to trust my instincts, and to value relationships based on mutual respect rather than unconditional acceptance. These lessons had come at an enormous cost, but they had also given me a foundation for living that was stronger and more authentic than anything I had built before. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the choices that led me to that park on the night Sarah Chen was murdered. The honest answer is complicated. I regret that my actions contributed to a situation where an innocent woman lost her life. I regret that my trust in Cheryl was so complete that I ignored warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy. But I don't regret learning the truth about who my daughter really was, because living with that truth, however painful, is better than living with a beautiful lie. The woman I am today is harder than the woman I was before, but she is also more honest, more compassionate, and more aware of the complex motivations that drive human behavior. I still love Cheryl, but now I love myself more. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. In a world where those closest to us can sometimes become our greatest enemies, learning to protect and value ourselves isn't selfish, it's essential for survival. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to rebuild your life after everything fell apart? Share your stories in the comments below, because sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the first step toward healing. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming impossible odds and finding strength in the darkest moments. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that recovery is possible even after the most devastating betrayals. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that no matter how dark things might seem, the truth has a way of surfacing, and new beginnings are always possible if we have the courage to pursue them. Until next time, take care of yourselves and trust your instincts, because sometimes they're the only protection we have.